It's great to be here, and a big thanks to the Milken Foundation and Faster Cures for having us here. And I want to dash all expectations because we will not find a cure for the cost of durable therapies on this panel today. But we will be discussing the issue, and it's a critical issue from both a commercial strategy perspective and a policy perspective. And I'll start off and say a few words about what we're going to be talking about, and then our panelists will take it away. So we are at a time where medical science is really on the cusp of providing major advances in gene therapy and in cellular therapy and cures for diseases that I think many of us thought that we would never see cured. And it's really kind of that evolution of medical science that is enabling this discussion. At the same time, the typical commercial models for bringing these products to market are really being challenged. It used to be, of course, that if you had a drug for treating cardiovascular disease or diabetes, that you had a very wide population on which you could spread the costs of the innovation. And for many of these cellular and genetic therapies, as well as tailored therapies to individuals, you just don't have that number of people on which you can spread the costs of the research and development and the like. And so it creates a friction point for health plans, for government, and ultimately, very importantly, for patients who want and need these therapies and are very eager to get their hands on them. And that's really the point that we are faced with right now. So we have on the panel, we have a wonderful and very diverse panel. The panelists are going to introduce themselves and say a little bit, but we have representatives from the life sciences industry, from government, from health plans, and of patient interests. And I think it's really kind of in those four areas that it's most important to be looking at this discussion, looking at this debate, and thinking about kind of what are the models for enabling these therapies to meet the patient demand. And that's really the setup, if you will. So we're going to start with Yvonne Greenstreet, and she will introduce herself. And I'd like to start, though, the panel in really thinking about the science. Like, where are we with respect to science for curative diseases? Why are we here? And kind of what is going on in your company that enables you to bring these therapies to patients?
Yes, no, delighted. So I'm Yvonne Greenstreet. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. And as you said in this panel, we might not find a cure for the cost of durable therapies, but we're working on cures that are durable. So I think it is a really exciting time in science. I mean, if I think back over the last 5 to 10 years, I've never seen so much scientific innovation and productivity. And really that has led to, already transformative treatments for patients, and will continue to deliver more innovation and more opportunity for patients. I mean, for instance, there's something like 1,000 studies ongoing at the moment that are looking at transformative treatments for patients. I think the way to look at the science maybe is in a few buckets, because I think that there are different considerations for different types of approaches to treating disease. The first, I think, is you alluded to that, are the sort of gene therapies, which, if you like, are a one and done treatment, hopefully. You have gene therapy for a condition perhaps like hemophilia, or recently a medicine called Luxturna was approved for patients who have a condition that results in blindness. And then if you have this gene therapy, one time, that should be a cure. You've also got approaches that are very transformative, and from a technological perspective have taken a long time to bring to bear and result in significant benefits for patients, quite often approaching a cure, but they're not one and done. They have to be given on an ongoing basis. perhaps once a month, perhaps twice a year. And actually, it's that category that my company, Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, is focused on, where we took some really exciting science that came out of a paper that was published in a scientific journal called Nature in 1998, won the Nobel Prize in 2006, and a company was formed around that to see how we could apply this science to treating human disease. And we were able to launch our first medicine for patients in the summer of this year. Really a medicine that is able to silence the genes that produce a disease-causing protein. And we've been able to demonstrate that not only can we delay progression of this particular disease called hereditary amyloidosis, but we can actually reverse some of the features of the disease. So it's a very, very exciting times. I think the third category is in the oncology area, where there's been just a huge number of medicines that have been developed that are really, changing the prognosis of cancer from being certain death to, ones where, patients can live for many, many years. And, they're the immuno-oncology approaches like CAR-T, which have really transformed the outlook for patients. And they're also the very innovative combinations of treatments where you bring together different medicines and they have a remarkable effect on patients. And I think all of those categories have different considerations with respect to the pricing considerations that we're going to be talking about subsequently. But I'd just like to leave this group with a perspective of just amazing science leading to oftentimes cures or significant benefits for patients that have come out of the science, and there is more to come. It's exciting times.
That's a great overview, and very helpful to kind of bucket the different categories, because curative therapies could mean a lot of different things. For your licensed therapy, how many patients do you treat, and how do you think about pricing for that technology?
It's a really good question. So our focus has been on rare diseases where you have many fewer patients that would be amenable to treatment. And for a technology like ours, which is very new, very innovative, as we thought about where to point this technology, there were a few considerations that were incredibly important to us. One was addressing diseases where there was a major medical need, where patients were having significant morbidity and increased mortality. And so we focused on a condition, as I said, called hereditary amyloidosis, which affects about 50,000 patients worldwide. Obviously, a lower number in the US, but that really is quite a small kind of group of patients that would be able to benefit from this innovation. And therefore, we price the drug as alongside how you price medicines for rare diseases, which range somewhere between $250,000 to $650,000 or so per year.
I'll say kind of to throw another example in there, my company Avalier is presently working with a life sciences company that has a therapy that is curative for a genetic disorder for 50 patients a year. You think about the math there, and it's the kind of thing that a child is born with. The child has to be actually airlifted to the facility that is doing this particular therapy because of production constraints. And the cost of it is substantial. They haven't priced it yet. But you think about that as a pricing problem, I think it's kind of even further along the scale, if you will.
Maybe I should just add one more thing, just to provide sort of the context, that many of you may know this already about how drugs actually get discovered and developed. But I talked about the journey of my company, which was a 16 to 20 year journey. The company has raised something like $4 billion over that period of time to be able to bring this technology to patients. And therefore, I think it's important to remember that when you are focused on coming up with true innovation, it's a very capital-intensive, high-risk endeavor, which is somewhat different from, some of the other more incremental improvements that you see in, some medicines that get brought to market.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. We're really fortunate to have Michael Sherman here from Harvard Pilgrim, and Harvard has been a leader in some of the more innovative contracting. And Michael, I'd love to just get your perspective. So think about the science and science coming in and the responsibility of a plan to balance so many things for patients. How do you think about new technology coming in and availability to patients and the like? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we really are trying to balance access and affordability. And if we don't do a good job of that and costs go up, people can't afford the therapies and you have access problems. And the problem is, for better or for worse, and it's primarily for better, is we have what is an onslaught of new therapies around cancer, different types of gene therapy, orphan diseases, which in the past would have been incurable. And we're saving lives and extending lives, and that's important. And it certainly fits my litmus test of, if you or a family member or loved one had this diagnosis, would you want them to get the drug? And if the answer is yes, then let's cut to the chase and figure out how to make sure that they do have access. The problem is many of these are expensive, and we're not really going to debate the pricing today. But as you heard, drug discovery is lengthy and risky, and if we don't figure out something that works for all parties, including the pharmaceutical companies, you won't have capital flow to these research efforts, and none of us benefit. So it really is a balancing act. A lot of people think, well, my insurance covers a drug, but in truth, there aren't that many levers. So when we see, let's say, a new therapy like an Alnylam drug or PCSK9 or gene therapy, we think about the budget impact, and essentially we can pay for that out of three different places. The deductible, how much you have to pay before the insurance kicks in. That's probably not really relevant when you're talking about a drug which is hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars a year. Mm-hmm. Second is a cost share, and I would say ditto. And third is premium. Uh-huh. So again, we try to balance these, but when you're talking about these high cost, really important innovative therapies, it's primarily premium. And if we don't manage them effectively and premiums go up too much, first of all, everyone's very upset with us. And second, you run the risk that they choose not to buy insurance, because in some cases, again, you know you have a diagnosis. In other cases, children are born with this and it's a random event. So you can't really plan for it. So the risk is that if we pay for everything and costs go up and there's not value consistent with those dollars, people won't get insurance and they won't have access to the drugs. So if you think about what we've done with the rest of the healthcare system, we're paying for value more and more. People don't question the fact that fee-for-service is not a really good model to driving toward value. Yet it's traditionally how we pay for most drugs in this country. So we've gotten a lot of positive attention, but to me, this really isn't a very controversial statement. It isn't a brilliant insight, it's common sense. Getting the forces together to actually execute on these and to negotiate them to make it work is not easy, but it's worthwhile. And so we've been trying to figure out, how do you take some of those concepts and apply them to the pharmaceutical industry? And as we see prices go up more and more, and again, sometimes for good reason, Onpattro, your drug is, I believe, listed for $450,000. We see gene therapies that are expected to be north of $1 or even $2 million. Mm-hmm. So, the costs are not insignificant. So as you see these higher prices come in, you can question whether they're worth it. And again, let's not have that debate today, because we'll go off the rails. But I don't think it's hard to argue that if it doesn't work, and few of these work in everyone, that it's not worth even close to that amount. So the question is, how do you put the framework together where we can pay a fair price when the drug is effective, but pay less when it isn't effective? And embedded in that is looking at outcome measures, data collection, what's fair to all parties and different stakeholders, making sure that what you measure matters actually to the patient. This industry is not known for being patient-centric, and again, at conferences like these, which pull together a great group of people, I think we're doing a better job. And let's talk about Alnylam specifically. So again, we knew that this important drug was coming out. And well, if you read the newspapers, you might think that pharma companies and payers are always pointing fingers at each other and adding the PBMs for good measure. The fact is, you know, like anything, it's about relationships.
Yeah.
And I have relationships at Alnylam that I value. I know the people there care about doing the right thing and have been slogging away for well over a decade trying to figure this out. So when they actually approached me, this is a case where they actually came to us probably a year before the drug was approved, which is probably a bit unusual. And they didn't come to us with a proposal that was baked. They said, help us figure it out. And we sat down and we had several multi-hour meetings. And I'd say, so how do you measure success in the pilot? And they'd explain to me, well, that's a research tool not used in the real world. So it got a little complicated. And we agreed at the end of the day that we would cover it in a way that was appropriate and fair to all individuals. Yet in cases where there was a suboptimal responder, the price would go down through a rebate mechanism, and we had a lot of debates, obviously, what constitutes a suboptimal responder. And I also asked the question in these meetings, I said, so what can happen if the drug doesn't work? And they said, oh, someone might need a liver transplant. Consequently, we agreed that if someone needs a liver transplant, and again, there's a couple of caveats, they can't be on the transplant list initially and have to be adherent to the medication, which seems fair. They'll pay for the cost of a liver transplant up to a certain cap. So that's an example, I think, where we work together in a way that I think if they had been in their offices and we in ours and hadn't really done a lot of collaborating, we wouldn't have been able to figure that out. When you look at gene therapies, one-time treatments that offer years of benefit, it gets even more complicated because you run into, in many cases, higher costs. And the question of how do you balance that when the institution giving the drug and paying for it may not benefit from follow-on years. And then there's questions around durability. So again, this is much more complicated to solve. Maybe we'll get into it a little bit later, but I will say we're looking at things like multi-payer pilots and paying over time and other innovations. And again, for many people, this is an interesting philosophical discussion. For me, this is my job. So, well, you can argue, well, we'll figure it out. Well, when these come to market, we have to figure out actually how to make them work and how to balance these issues if we're going to make them available to our members.
So, so I asked Yvonne one question about cost, because I want us to come back to that since that's the theme, finding a cure for the cost of durable therapies. How do you think in aggregate as a health plan about the cost of medical therapy coming to market? Where were you in terms of a percentage of medical costs 20 years ago, 10 years ago, now? And where do you project you will be in the future with these new therapies coming out? How do you think about that and how to fit it into the box?
That's a great question, and I think it's actually, it should be a nuanced question because we know
nuance away.
We know from our data, so we can all argue about facts and alternate facts and everything, and we could debate that, and we could debate what percentage of the healthcare dollar is spent on drugs, and there's different numbers from different groups frankly with different data sets.
Right.
Now, one thing I do have is data, so it actually isn't that hard for me to go look at our spend and say, what are we spending? And I've done that, and we've actually published that in Health Affairs. And so in our book of business, commercial, fully insured business, we actually are spending about 25 cents out of every healthcare dollar on drugs. Now that actually underestimates the spend because we don't have visibility into what percent of the dollars we pay hospitals go for drugs that are spent during hospitalization. And that's been going up over time. We went back about 6 or 7 years, and it was about 18 to 20%. But I would also add this includes a pharmacy benefit and the medical benefit. So frequently when people talk about this, it's pharmacy benefit. Well, if you think about the part that's actually going up fastest, it's a medical benefit, which are generally physician administered infused drugs, like most cancer drugs, including the CAR Ts, like pretty much all of the gene therapies, like the Alnylam drug. So that piece is only about 5% of the spend, but it's growing in our book,
rapidly.
It's growing 15 to 20% a year, and
how do you make room for all of that? How do you make room for all of that cost?
That is a wonderful question, and to the extent, and if you
come on, keep making room.
So there's and the fact is, and sometimes there's complete cost offsets.
Right.
Other times there's not. But I would want to make the point first. There's nothing magic or good or bad about numbers. So when I tell you 25%. That's just a number. I think it'll go up to 30 or 35% within 5 to 10 years. And I think that may be a good thing. So when you hear that, it isn't bad to the extent we're reducing hospitalization, reducing the treatment burden of chronic illness. improving people's lives, which may not have a cost offset, which is really pretty important, extending lives of individuals who would have died of cancer or really terrible childhood diseases, that's value. So if we're talking about a drug that's several $100,000 or $1 million, we should be happy about that in many cases. And if you're talking about, I don't know, a $5,000 drug for toenail fungus, maybe not so much. So it really depends where the spend is. So again, a lot of debate about this. In many countries, they use quality adjusted life years as a measure. In this country, we have no formal mechanism. But if you look at what ICER, the Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research, and others are doing, they're using pretty much 150,000 per quality as an upper limit. Now that's complicated and controversial, and once you talk about small populations, whether it's 50 or something more, frankly, you need to think about a different upper limit, or you're going to unfairly penalize those who have the misfortune to be afflicted with these diseases. So our feeling is that we can absorb a certain amount in terms of thinking on a quality basis, and if we spend in a way that's commensurate with that, I think we can make it work. Keep in mind that there's about 661 trials of innovative high-cost therapies. MIT Newdig's just presented these numbers through their research that are currently being studied. And if even a fraction of those come to market, we're going to hit some constraints. And I think the best way to think about balancing those constraints is using some common metrics. The other thing I'll say is in this country, we act as if a dollar spent on one thing does not mean we can't spend dollars on other things. We don't think in terms of total budget impacts, except perhaps for state Medicaid agencies.
Right.
And I think when I look at what's on the advent in the next 3 to 5 years, if we're not smarter about how we price things, how we pay for them, making sure we're fair to all parties, I think we're going to run into a crack up at a point where these costs get to a level where insurance may become unaffordable, employers have trouble paying for them, you run into some serious issues. The good news is I think many of us are getting ahead of it, and the fact we're having this dialogue speaks to that.
Great. Wow, that's a lot of content. So we're not going to go off the rail. We're just going to skate on the rail for a little while, which is a good place to be, I think, to have this discussion. We're really fortunate also to have Mark Skinner here, and Mark has spent his career as a patient advocate in hemophilia and other areas, and really just like to open it up to your perspective on this discussion from a patient perspective, and how do you think patient interests are being served in this discussion?
So I begin the discussion by, no patient should ever have to apologize for the cost of their disease. Hemophilia is, it's a pretty financially toxic disease. My drug spend is about 95% of my healthcare spend. My drug bill this year will be somewhere north of $800,000, partly driven. I just had my 10th orthopedic surgery about 10 days ago. Hemophilia is a disease that really manifests itself in sort of crippling arthropathy, chronic pain, sort of lifelong disability. I've been fortunate to have insurance that's allowed me to correct that. Gene therapy is on the horizon. I would say it's going to be here in 18 months, 2 years. It's going to be curative technology for hemophilia that would actually correct and prevent the manifestations of bleeding are here. So one of the things that we've tried to do within the hemophilia community is think about what my life was in the 1960s when I was born, and how did we define value, and how have drugs been developed to the point that we are today, and is that the same metric that we want to use as we go forward and think about a cure? And the answer is no. That what we were able to achieve with science in the 1960s to prevent and mitigate bleeding is a very different thing than a transformative therapy. So I think the science of outcomes research is as important as the clinical development and the regulatory science. And so what we have been trying to do within our community is really in a pre-competitive space for gene therapy, because there's at least 9 companies now working on gene therapy for hemophilia. It's a pretty robust space, which is exciting for me. But we wanted to see if we could bring early alignment. So attempting to do something that had not been done before, bringing not only the regulators, so we had the FDA, the EMA, and Canadians and other regulatory bodies come sit down with us. On the back end, we had 6 of the major US insurers, as well as health technology assessment agencies, which did include ICER here in the US, Curative in Canada, and ICE in the UK. And then within the middle space, we had the patients and the clinicians, companies, and all, at least at the time, there were 8 gene therapy companies that were all in phase 2 or later trials participated. And so our goal was to see if we could align around a core set of outcomes that would actually define value or redefine value as we knew it today in hemophilia. And so bringing the people together, we recognize that there are a set of outcomes that regulators need. There's a set of outcomes that payers want, and then there's a set of things that matter to me as a patient in my day-to-day life. And data collection is expensive. Measuring value is expensive. And we can't move in steps and silos of market authorization, market access, and then healthcare decision making that we really need to align across the full spectrum. So over the course of 6 months, relatively rapidly, we agreed and we aligned on a core set of 6 outcomes and defined what those were, and then went to the payers and said, if these data are collected, would you consider them in your value proposition? And then we asked the companies that in your phase 3 development programs, will you in fact include these in your development base? And then to those of us that are patients in the middle, as the new technologies come forward, there are going to be populations and subpopulations that will be more appropriate or not appropriate for the use of the technology. And so if we can align in the front end, then could we all on the back end actually demonstrate the value that would allow us to move the standard forward. Now, I'm fortunate there's probably a cost offset, so the $1 million gene therapy for me is probably going to seem like a good value over a couple years as it relates to the potential cost of what gene therapy will be. But I think the model is one that can be instructive across disease spaces. Too often we get to the end of the process and the clinical trial results that are published have sort of one sentence, and the secondary outcomes and patient-reported outcomes or health-related quality of life were met. But really defining what that means on the front end, I think, is going to be important to tipping the balance in that gray area. Is it affordable? Is it really useful? The example that I use is the metric which we've used for 50 years is how many times a year do I have a bleeding episode? Well, I can manage those bleeding episodes by sitting on the couch and being sedentary and having a limited quality of life, making career decisions about what kind of life is low risk, where do I go on vacation, or I can correct it, the clotting factor that my blood is missing, and have a normal quality of life like anybody else. You can get to 0 bleeds both ways, but they're dramatically different from how a patient would define value. So our goal is to try to change the education and the conversation with the payers on the back end, but to make sure that we're all aligned through the process. You still need the reimbursement mechanisms, but if we as patients can get involved early, and the companies recognize that we need to be sitting at the table really in the phase 1, in the translational period of saying, are you developing a therapy that's going to affect an outcome relative to me, then I think that will be successful.
Mark, you've done a lot of work in determining outcomes around hemophilia. Does it concern you that health plans today are paid more money if they control diabetes, control cardiovascular disease, and provide important preventive therapies, but they do not get paid more money if they better control hemophilia?
I don't know that I've quite thought about it in that spectrum.
Sorry to be blunt.
Yeah, no,
my role as moderator.
Well, we spend less money if we control it.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean,
that's true. But in terms of the bonus payments from the federal government, for example, I would argue that they're not focused on a lot of the diseases that we're talking about here with respect to durable therapies.
So I think that is the challenge. So there is a long history of treatment, but a lot of the rare diseases, 7,000 rare diseases, most of them don't have a treatment. They have very limited ability to manage care. And so getting the focus on the rare diseases, the non-communicable diseases, those that are really underserved, is going to be a major strain. And for the most part, most of those rare diseases are not well organized. They don't have support. And for us to do the kinds of things that we're able to do in our community, to collect data, to generate value, to sort of lead the conversation, it is not going to exist. So it's going to take systems to help make sure that they don't fall behind just simply because they've been neglected or overlooked within the system as we know it today.
Michael, you want to jump in on that one? Seems like you might want to say something.
No, I think these are all important points, and again, I think most health plans understand it's important to treat hemophiliacs, not discriminate against them. And again, you're right that the risk adjustment payments mean that we lose money. with each hemophiliac who's in our population. Now, but again, to my other point, we lose less if they're well controlled. So I think the issue is that, and this gets to other points of policy, which is that it's really important that everyone have insurance, because if the only people who buy insurance are people with rare disease like hemophilia, it doesn't work and their premiums are not affordable. So when everyone has insurance, some people need it, some don't, more or less, and the system works, and that that's very functioning. But I'll tell you where I think there's risk though. If the pricing is unconscionably high, and there's not value to be seen in terms of the metrics, health plans may choose not to cover the gene therapy. And in fact, self-insured employers are not subject to the same rules, et cetera. They can exclude it. In fact, there's association plans and other things happening from a policy perspective which can be put in place and which can exclude these type of treatments. Now, the reason it's an issue, less for me, I'm clinically driven, I want to do the right thing, but the finance people look at that and they point out that there's a thing called adverse selection, which means if your competitors are not covering a gene therapy and you are, and all the hemophiliacs come to you, you have a financial problem. You may be doing the right thing, but if you're not around to do the right thing in another 2 years, you've got a problem.
Which of
so
course
a lot of those create risk for the whole environment and ecosystem.
So a couple of points. First, so I was on the board of a mid-cap managed care company when Medicare Advantage started paying for quality through the star ratings. And there was a very noticeable shift in the operations towards ensuring that those outcomes measures would be achieved. And I don't think that there's really any controversy over the idea that providers, payers, and others respond to the financial incentives that are in front of them. And for these durable therapies, there aren't financial measures aside from potentially averting costs that I would say are on the revenue side of the ledger. And the second thing, before we get to Joe, is that I think you kind of put your hand on a really critical question here with respect to the role of government, in that, if you have a level playing field and every plan is required to do the same thing, then you don't have that adverse selection problem necessarily, unless you happen to be geographically located or you happen to be marketing to a group that is less likely to have those conditions. So there is potentially a role for government in ensuring kind of the availability of these therapies. So we'll come back.
I want to respond to one other thing.
Yeah.
So, again,
I knew I wouldn't get away with that.
You heard before that your expense on factor is just south of $1 million a year. So, and this speaks to how we solve some of the things that I'm concerned about. We do it by thinking differently, by being innovative in terms of these frameworks. So, again, you're at the high end, obviously, and unfortunately, but it's common for hemophiliacs to spend a couple $100,000 a year. Now, I actually think the gene therapies for hemophilia are not going to be $1 million. I think for various reasons. I'm calling them $1.5 to $3 million. We have this parlor game trying to figure out where they're going to come in for different gene therapies. But and again, you can understand from the gene therapy from the manufacturer if that's a spend. Maybe they feel they can charge that amount. But anyway, if we think about a framework where we're paying, again, for an average hemophiliac, maybe $300,000 a year, $400,000 a year for that gene therapy, let's say for 5 years, we can make that budget impact disappear as a reason not to cover it. And by the way, since we're not 100% sure whether it'll still work in 4 or 5 years, which kind of is a factor if you believe that it's worth $2 million, what if we pay for it over time to help with the budget impact, and we agree we're going to stop paying for it if it stops working? And all of a sudden you figure it out, heads you win, tails you don't lose, and you remove those economic disincentives on the part of payers and employers to get in the way of the treatment that you and your stakeholders and those with this disease need.
Okay, I think we've warmed up the table really nicely for Joe. I'm going to give Joe just a kind of a modest introduction here. Joe has a really important job in the White House Office of Management and Budget. He oversees healthcare there. And so what that means is that Medicare policy, Medicaid policy, discretionary health policy all crosses his desk, and he's also responsible for interagency coordination with respect to these healthcare concerns. And so he's really the ideal person in a lot of ways to have on the panel. And I think I'd just like to open it up because you've heard a lot. We've talked about the science, we've talked about the manufacturer perspective. In a lot of ways, the government is a major payer and sets the rules of the road, and some of the comments that that Michael just made in terms of kind of the role of government in leveling the playing field and eliminating the potential for adverse selection, as well as the patient issues. So you can kind of take your pick and go where you like to go.
Sure, thanks. I know I've got an important job because Dan had the same job back in the Clinton administration.
It was 20 years ago, but,
First, it's kind of cool to be on a panel discussing this, because I was at FDA during the Bush administration, and at the time, all the heat we were getting was that FDA was dysfunctional and wasn't going to be able to keep up with the science of approving these types of technologies, and wasn't approving new therapies quickly enough. And then I spent a time in the private sector. I was actually at Gilead when we purchased Pharmasset and launched the hepatitis C medicines, and of course that created all sorts of challenges to the system, and having a cure that was high cost but basically done in 8 to 12 weeks. Now to be in the administration that's uniquely focused on drug prices, every day we spend time on the drug pricing issue. It's on my calendar every single day. I have staff meetings, interagency meetings, reading stuff about it, various policy proposals and levers. And we have done a lot to move things forward in order to create headroom for these types of therapies. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll see data that shows that the trajectory of drug prices has moderated a great deal in the last 18, 20 months. A lot of that due to the number of generics that FDA has approved at record pace at a time when the number of patent expiries has declined. So one of the things that you need to do if you want to pay for these therapies is create headrooms for all the inefficiencies. There is tons of money sloshing through the healthcare system, courtesy of the American taxpayer, every day. And we should be able to pay for cures and durable therapies that are high cost. I mean, one of the reasons why they have to be so high cost is because they are focused on so few people. If there were wastage in the system, if you were giving if it only helped 50 people, but you were giving it to 10,000 or 20,000, you could lower the price. A lot of the drugs, the mass spectrum drugs that we've used in the past, they don't have this level of durability. They don't have this level of efficacy. So you're paying for true value in a very simple way that you can measure, that's far simpler than a lot of the value-based design on the payer side. I think we're still on the value-based, this is a different conversation, but on the value-based side, on the payer side, we're really at the alpha stage. We're paying for process, and it's very difficult to evaluate how, what various interventions are doing to suck money out of the system, and they're difficult to understand. Getting value in the drug delivery and purchasing should be the model for how we think these things through. It's complicated, but it's doable. Now, one of the big challenges is it's really hard to look at the various levers and policies that the government has. In the discussion before we came in, we were talking about best price being a warping of the system. If Harvard Pilgrim wants to come in and say, hey, listen, we'll cure everybody in our system for X number of dollars to a particular pharmaceutical company, that price may have to be carried over to a provider that isn't going to make that level of commitment. And that provides an incentive for companies to say, I can't cut that deal with Harvard because there's going to be free riders down the road who are not going to treat our product and the patients we want to serve with the level of diligence. So you look at these levers that you have to push. We've gotten a far too complicated of a drug purchasing system. There's far too many regulations that are in place. And whether you're looking at the value on the payer side or the value that we're trying to get in the drug side, we're really trying to get to simplicity and flatten some of these things out. I'm hopeful that we will find solutions to some of these things on the policy side. I will say you guys are on the cutting edge. When I came in, I take a lot of meetings from payers who would say we have to figure out how to pay for these high things, and I do another meeting with a drug company, and they'd say we have to pay for these products that we're going to have coming down the market, but they weren't talking to one another.
Right.
And I'd say, look, you can't come in and tell me you got a problem. You have to come in with a solution.
Right.
And I think the next stage is to get a state Medicaid to come in, and I'd love to see the financial markets come in. I mean, obviously, it'd be great if somebody as inspired by Michael Milken's success in the investing markets would come in and say, hey, listen, we can figure out a way to provide a financing vehicle for some of these things. We've got the state of Tennessee, we've got our biggest payer here, we've got this drug company, and we've got this other one that's interested in, and we've got a financial instrument that we can monetize, that we can sell on the open market, and we just figured this out. That, to me, is the holy grail. And if we can be at the table as the government and say, great, we can make this change, and this change, we're happy to have that meeting and work on that, because we definitely want to control cost, get value into the system, and we are pro-innovation. We want to see Americans benefit from innovation, and we want to see America leading the way in biopharmaceutical innovation.
So I think in a lot of ways, you and your colleagues are really uniquely qualified to clean up a lot of the inconsistencies around the pricing, which makes sense, and it's great to see the progress along those lines. I'm curious to get your perspective, and I'll want to ask all the panelists before we go to Q&A, about how you see the concept of value for these curative therapies. So let's say you have a gene therapy for a baby that needs that gene therapy to live. How do you think about value there? And kind of as we start to talk about price and availability and access, one of the things you're saying is, hey, we need to create headroom. Generics makes sense. Like that makes complete sense. More competition for branded therapies by making sure the formularies work right makes sense. Like all that makes sense. But when you get into these more curative therapies, how do you think about value?
Yeah, I think it's tough. I mean, I'm skeptical of importing the idea of quality-adjusted life years and some of the measures that ICER has brought into the system. I think it's, to the point earlier, you have to figure out the patient needs the product. You've got a technology that can be delivered to the patient. How do we absorb it as a country and as a payer? Evaluating over time whether or not it's durable is a challenge. We've got to make sure there's no regulations or policies in place that deter a pay over time scenario or a value-based arrangement that allows for a refund if it's not as durable as understood. That being said, I will say, as a veteran of the hepatitis C experience, there was a lot of junk science that was thrown out after those products were approved by a lot of payers to say, well, we don't know if this thing is actually going to work and actually going to be durable over time. And that skepticism about the science, about the FDA approval, can't be used as a lever to confuse the situation. We have to be functioning on the best science that's available. Sure, this is new technology and it may not be durable over time. There should be some safeguards in place, but we shouldn't say, hey, listen, this cure for hemophilia didn't have as many patients as we would have liked. It doesn't have 10 years of study. It doesn't have 20 years of study, so we're going to refuse to cover it.
So this is this is an interesting discontinuity, because the pharmaceutical companies could not make a claim without that claim being approved by the FDA, whereas Avalere could do the same study for a health plan, and that information could be kind of given out into the public without any scrutiny from the FDA. Are you guys going to level the playing field on information?
Well,
I couldn't resist.
It's all right. I mean, look, Commissioner Gottlieb was a veteran of the FDA fights in the Bush administration when there were a lot of First Amendment efforts to allow pharmaceutical companies to free up more communications of these things. And he's spoken publicly, and he's done. They have pushed a number of guidance documents out. We'll see if he's got more. But yeah, the pharmaceutical companies should be able to communicate more information to payers and to patients and physicians about what works, cost effectiveness, that can help bring costs down too. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies should be in the game about explaining why their products are of true value. And right now, a lot of the regulations that are in place prevent them from being part of the discussion, and it's unfortunate.
So Yvonne, let me ask quickly, when you think about value, both when you're bringing products to market, in figuring out what kinds of claims you want to be able to make, and also in evaluating where you want to spend your limited resources to do new development, how do you think about value?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, just listening to the panel, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that really the potential of science has really gotten ahead of, the issues that are in our ecosystem. And I've been very actually encouraged by the conversation on this panel in terms of some of the ways we can think about addressing those challenges. And I really appreciated some of the comments you made around generics and competition, and then removing some of the impediments that get in the way of us being able to think about this together. The other thing I'm taking away from this conversation is actually the need to bring together all the different stakeholders to really have a profound conversation about what could work here. Mm-hmm. What we've tried to do very hard as we've thought about our programs and where to invest our dollars and what types of studies to progress has been really to try and get that patient perspective in right at the very beginning so we can understand what patients value. And I think Michael spoke to the fact that very early on in our thinking, we engaged the payers to try to understand what we needed to do to meet the needs of the payers. And I think it really is that shared perspective of value where we can get the different stakeholders around the table to kind of work together to think about solutions going forward. One other point that hasn't been made that I'd like to make is around the part that we need to play as manufacturers in the biopharmaceutical industry in not increasing pricing where we haven't actually delivered additional evidence of value. So there is this kind of historical approach of raising prices every year without necessarily bringing any new value to the table, and that's something that I think we need to pay more attention to.
Yvonne,
just to finish, one of the things that we've done at Alnylam as well has actually made a sort of public commitment to ensuring that we won't raise prices beyond CPI.
helpful. Joe made a comment with some skepticism about quality-adjusted life years. You have to report that information in Europe today as it is. Why rely on it in Europe and not rely on it in the United States? Like, what is your perspective on that metric and whether it should be introduced into this market?
I think, look, many of the models for looking at value have pros and cons, and they all have their issues and their benefits. And one of the challenges is actually making sure you've got the right data set in which to be able to use appropriate methodologies to come up with measurements of values. And I'm not convinced that there's any actually one measure of value out there that works in every situation. I think that is one of the opportunities that we have as a shared ecosystem to try to think about how we measure value in different settings. I think there's a nuance to it. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all strategy.
Fair. Let's hear from Mark and then Michael, and then we'll open it up to questions. Mark, there's been a lot of discussion about value here from a patient perspective. For durable therapies, how do you think about value?
So the definition of value to me begins with the patient. So we spend a lot of time talking about patient-reported outcomes, but a patient-reported outcome is not necessarily a patient-relevant outcome. And so it really has to begin with the conversation of understanding what is relevant to the patient. And if that doesn't occur early in the process, then the whole system's going to break down when we get to the end. And so too often, I think the conversations, whether it's the early advice that happens when a company goes into the FDA on a clinical development program, or they'll go in and sit down with a payer, it's the payer and the manufacturer, or the manufacturer and the regulator, but the patient is not at that table. And so figuring out how the systems can allow patients to be an equal partner in that conversation, I think is fundamentally critical to getting the definition of value. And I think then once that element of value is defined, then when you start thinking about the economic models, whether you're used within an HTA or whether you're used by ICER or one of the payers in the US, then the outcomes that are important to patients, we're going to have the data to answer those. Too often now, you look at an ICER report or you look at a report out of SBU or NICE, and they just simply indicate data not available. And that's a problem. So if there's an outcome that's important to me as a patient, we need to be in the beginning of the process, and then we can hold the payers accountable to say, include that metric in the value. When you're defining the quality adjusted life years, the cost per quality, then I know that the issue that I care about. And if I don't come out and it's not successful in that scenario, then at least I've had a fair shot. But now it doesn't always work that way. So I think the system has to be re-engineered, and the patients really have to be at both of those conversations early on.
Michael, you're on the forefront of a lot of these discussions, and as a leader in value-based contracting, we'll give you the last word, and then we'll see what's on the mind of the audiences for a couple of lightning rounds here before we close.
Yeah, first, I don't disagree with anything I've heard here, but so you're hearing a lot of things, and I'll try to pull it together a little bit. One way to pull it together is to think of it as solving for a set of simultaneous equations. So for the health plan, we need to think about the value we're getting, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but the budget impact, that's one piece. There's a piece of what is the impact on the patient financials and on premiums, et cetera. Mm-hmm. For the companies, again, is it a fair return given what they've invested, given the cost of manufacturing, which usually isn't relevant, those sort of metrics. The piece about quality and qualities, again, it's controversial, it's messy, there may be better systems, but I want to make an important point here. I get a lot of calls from investment bankers and Avaliers and others. How would you treat a drug if it were priced at $500,000 or $700,000, whatever, those sort of things? And they're trying to get me to say what our policy would be. Mm-hmm. And what I always tell them is that's a wrong question. Without knowing anything more, I don't know whether a drug at $250,000 or $500,000 or $1 million is a fair price. It depends. It depends on the benefit. So whether you like qualities or like something else, we need some mechanism so that we're talking about that price relative to the benefit so we can have an intelligent conversation. Because I will tell you, a lot of my colleagues, and I'm in meetings with them, will have a knee-jerk response given on a certain price. No, we wouldn't cover it there. And I think that's often a situation where you don't have the right information to actually make an informed decision. Mm-hmm. So, it's complicated. I think we need to, again, think about how we make the system work. Yep. How we think, from the pharma companies, you mentioned Hep C. Let's, again, not have a deep debate, but one of the things that happened there was that health plans were surprised, and they were surprised in a way that impacted their budget that they weren't able to price into, which is looking 12 to 18 months ahead. So that created problems for the payers, which created problems for the pharma companies, which created problems for the patients. So you need that kind of communication ahead of the point. And the other thing is, and again, the prices have come down with competition. I think we're at a very fair place with Hep C treatment. However, when they first came out, no one actually anticipated the price based on another metric, which would be what is a fair market return, market size of that company. And they priced it in a way that no one expected based on the latest estimates being anywhere from 4 to 5 million Americans having hepatitis C. So again, I think there's a sense of fairness in most people's minds that if it's 50 or 50,000 or 5 million, that the unit cost should maybe be a little bit different. So all of the things we need to consider.
Yeah, look, I think that you're hearing actually a lot of points of congruence on the panel, and Yvonne saying different metrics at different times and kind of choose and try to navigate towards something, when Michael's saying show me something and it has to make sense, and these are really the kind of the core of what we're talking about here. So with that, let me open it up and see if there are a couple questions, and then I will ask the panelists to respond exceedingly quickly to the. So let's see if we can cover a little bit of territory here. I have one right here.
Thank you.
Yeah, we hear you.
My name is John Birch. I'm with the Mid-America Angels and Angel Investment Group in Kansas City. My question is about digital health and about healthcare data. I'd like each of you to comment, if you would, on the what I think is the gorilla in the room of any discussion of costs in healthcare, which is the inappropriateness of the healthcare data infrastructure that we have, that we rely on for virtually all the decisions that are made. RCTs were invented back in the 60s, and they were a great source of progress. But the way we get real-world data now, patient-centered data, and so on, is badly needed and woefully inadequate for the kinds of decisions I think that you're talking about.
Okay, so that we can move through to other questions, I'll say, who wants that? Which one panelist would like to respond to the data question? I'm going to give it to Michael.
So,
if you don't mind.
Do I have an hour?
Well, no, you have 10 seconds.
I have 10 seconds. So, I
mean,
agree there's a lot here. There's issues around collecting the measures that matter. We know how to collect information on diabetes. When you're talking about hereditary TTR amyloidosis, a lot harder. We're developing new approaches and new infrastructures. And quite frankly, I think there's new models that some of us have proposed. For example, why not come out with drugs, price them at a fair point, and agree with an all or none type of payment mechanism. They'll get paid if it shows what it's purported to do, no payment if not, based on incomplete data. We know that, again, how do you do a clinical trial with 50 or 500 individuals? Very hard. And so how do you balance the ethics of not denying these individuals access to the drugs while you collect the data? So you come out with something like that, where essentially a real-world clinical trial, the payers pay for it when it works. You use that information, you get real-world data, and then come up with a formal approval with a standard payment.
I'll add that Harvard has actually been a real leader in actually using the data to structure clinical improvement-based contracts with pharmaceutical companies. So I think in some ways they've kind of exceeded expectations there. We have a couple of questions over here.
Ian Kramer from the Lead Coalition. Question for Mr. Grogan. I wonder if you could discuss the White House's perspective or OMB's perspective on addressing what will eventually be a first disease-modifying therapy for a very high volume of patient population at a very high cost, and that's in the space of Alzheimer's disease.
I don't have the answer. I mean, look, it's why we're here, right? I mean, this is a problem. Hemophilia is a problem, but if we get a cure for Alzheimer's priced at $100,000 or $1 million a pop, we're toast. I mean, we do not have a way. I mean, I suppose we could issue a massive bond issuance out of the Treasury and say we're going to do this and invest it as a country. That's an option.
Shut down the Department of Defense. I mean, there are a few options.
There are a lot of pieces of HHS I'd shut down before I shut down the
Do you want to elaborate?
Let's get the next question before Joe gets into more trouble.
Hi, Jupiter Lasmore, Georgetown University. I'm trying to think, when you think about the fact that these are durable therapies, and oftentimes you're going to have patients living much longer after they receive these therapies, is there any space for hybrid financing models, maybe with having high upfront costs that are paid for with insurance companies' patients, but then over time kind of kickback or revenue coming from whatever patients then continue to make, either percentage models or kind of annual payment models, not necessarily towards the cost of the drug, but kind of as a kickback or a dividend on this investment of a patient.
Who wants to take that?
Our lawyers hate it when I get engaged in public debates that have the word kickback.
Exactly. The word kickback is not what we're commenting on here. Let me just be clear.
So I'll just make a general comment rather than getting into specifics. And I think we do need to consider, much more innovative financial models to think about, particularly some of the gene therapy drugs. As you were saying, like very high upfront and uncertain durability. So I absolutely agree that there's a need to really be much more creative. I mean, you've talked about it too. I mean, I don't know that we want to get into the details of what that could look like, but Michael may be the best.
Yeah, I'll just add that we need to make sure that we don't unfairly penalize the patient by virtue of these
Right.
models. So for example, pragmatically for just a moment, so we're talking about how do we pay over several years for treatment instead of upfront. In doing that, we're being careful to come up with a model where the patient doesn't pay 5 cost shares over 5 years
Right.
because we found a new mechanism. So, agree high level, but we need to make sure we don't punish the patient.
I think it's really meaningful that Michael is the one making that point, because insurance companies today do really think about patient burden, and that's key. Do you want to comment on this one as well before we close it off?
That was certainly going to be part of the point. I think that if there is a degree of transparency and we understand what that metric is, then patients will be willing to be partners. But if they're not part of the conversation, it's imposed upon them, then I think the system's going to collapse. So I do think patients recognize that healthcare is expensive, and they are going to appreciate, particularly if in the high-cost space, that they need to be partners in that. But aligning on how that metric's going to work and how it's going to work downstream has to be decided up front with a great deal of transparency.
So I want to close by just thanking the Milken Institute for convening this. I think all of the panelists have said in one way or another that this is exactly the kind of dialogue that we need to be having. So please join me in thanking the panelists.